The sound of dirt hitting a wooden coffin echoed across the windswept cemetery as Kane Blackwood stood alone, his weathered hat clutched against his chest, knuckles white with grief. The year was 1878, and the harsh Dakota Territory had claimed another soul, his brother, the last of his kin. A cold October wind cut through his wool coat, but Kane barely felt it. The pain of loss had numbed him to everything else. That was when he felt it, warm fingers sliding between his own, a gentle pressure that startled him from his solitude. He turned, disbelief washing over his face as he found himself staring into eyes he thought he'd never see again. "Grace," he whispered, the name catching in his throat like a prayer. Grace Montgomery stood beside him, her honey-brown hair tucked beneath a modest black bonnet, her green eyes just as he remembered them, full of determination and that quiet strength he'd fallen for years ago. She'd aged some, fine lines at the corners of her eyes, but to Kane, she was still the most beautiful woman he'd ever known. "I read about your brother in the newspaper," she said softly, her gloved hand still holding his. "I thought you might be here alone." Kane couldn't find words. 5 years had passed since he'd last seen her, since that terrible day when their futures had shattered like glass on stone. Now here she was, standing beside him at his brother's grave, as if those years had been merely a blink. "You didn't have to come," he finally managed, his voice rough with emotion. Grace's eyes never left his. "Yes, I did." The cemetery stood on a small hill overlooking the growing town of Redemption Creek. Below them, the collection of wooden buildings and dirt streets that made up the settlement seemed insignificant against the vast expanse of prairie that surrounded it. In the distance, the Blackwood Ranch, his ranch now, was just visible, a lonely outpost against the darkening sky. "How did you know I'd be here?" Kane asked, unable to process her presence. The last he'd heard, she was back east, married to the banker's son she'd been promised to before Kane had ever ridden into town. "I've been in Redemption Creek for 3 days," she explained, finally releasing his hand as the gravedigger finished his work and departed with a respectful nod. "I came as soon as I heard about James." Kane replaced his hat, hiding his eyes beneath the brim. "And your husband? Is he waiting in town?" A flicker of something passed across Grace's face, pain, perhaps, or resignation. "There is no husband, Kane, not anymore." The revelation hung between them, heavy with unspoken questions. Kane had spent 5 years trying to forget this woman, trying to convince himself that she belonged to another life, another version of himself. Yet here she was, and the feelings he'd buried were clawing their way back to the surface. "I have a room at the Western Star Hotel," Grace continued when Kane remained silent. "I'll be there for a few more days if you'd like to talk." She paused, then added, "About James, or anything else." Kane nodded stiffly, not trusting himself to speak further. He watched as she turned and made her way down the cemetery path, her black mourning dress billowing slightly in the wind. Only when she disappeared from sight did he exhale the breath he'd been holding. He looked down at his brother's fresh grave, the mound of dirt still dark against the yellowing grass of the cemetery. "What do you think of that, James?" he murmured. She always did have timing that could knock a man sideways. The ride back to the Blackwood Ranch was longer than usual, each hoofbeat of Kane's stallion demon seeming to echo the thoughts hammering in his mind. The sprawling ranch house came into view as he crested the final hill, a solid 2-story structure of logs and stone that his father had built 20 years earlier. It was a good house, big enough for a family. The family Kane had once dreamed of having with Grace. As he approached the stables, his foreman, Hank Willis, emerged from the barn. At 56, Hank had been with the Blackwoods since before Kane was born, and he was more family than employee. "Burial go all right?" Hank asked, taking Demon's reins as Kane dismounted. "As right as these things ever go," Kane replied, removing his hat to run a hand through his dark hair. Grace Montgomery was there. Hank's bushy eyebrows shot up. "Miss Grace, back in Redemption Creek, seems that way." Kane unbuckled his saddle, lifting it from Demon's back. "Says she's staying at the Western Star for a few days." Hank was quiet for a moment, brushing down Demon with practiced strokes. "You going to go see her?" "I don't know," but Kane did know. From the moment Grace had taken his hand at the graveside, he'd known he would seek her out. Some wounds never healed properly, and Grace Montgomery was the deepest wound Kane had ever suffered. That night, sleep eluded him. Kane stared at the ceiling of his bedroom, memories flooding back unbidden. He'd met Grace in the spring of 1873 when he'd ridden into Redemption Creek to sell cattle. She'd been working in her father's general store, her laughter drawing him in like a beacon. Their courtship had been swift and passionate, conducted largely in secret due to her father's disapproval. Old Montgomery had higher aspirations for his only daughter than a cattleman with dirt under his fingernails, no matter how successful his ranch might be. When Kane had finally gathered the courage to ask for her hand, Montgomery had already arranged her marriage to Edwin Porter, son of the local banker and a man with clean hands and a future in politics. Grace had been given no choice in the matter. The last time Kane had seen her, she'd been crying on the porch of her father's house, begging him to understand that she had obligations she couldn't escape. Kane had ridden away that day, vowing never to set foot in town again unless absolutely necessary. He'd thrown himself into the ranch, expanding the operation alongside his brother until the Blackwood brand was known throughout the territory. And if he sometimes woke in the night with the ghost of her touch still warm on his skin, well, that was his burden to bear. Dawn found him already dressed and saddling Demon. He told himself he was just going to town for supplies, but Hank's knowing look as Kane rode out told him no one was fooled by the pretense. Redemption Creek had grown in the years since Kane had last walked its streets regularly. New buildings had sprung up, and the dusty Main Street now boasted wooden sidewalks outside most establishments. The Western Star Hotel stood at the far end, a 3-story structure with pretensions of grandeur that seemed out of place in the frontier town. Kane tied Demon to the hitching post outside and stood for a long moment, gathering his courage. Finally, he climbed the steps and entered the lobby, the smell of beeswax and coffee greeting him. The clerk behind the desk looked up, recognition flashing in his eyes. "Mr. Blackwood," he nodded. "Sorry about your brother, fine man." "Thank you," Kane replied. "I'm looking for Miss Montgomery. She's staying here." The clerk hesitated. "She's taking breakfast in the dining room, sir." Kane nodded his thanks and made his way through the lobby to the small dining area at the back. There were only a few patrons at this early hour, and he spotted Grace immediately, sitting alone by the window, a cup of coffee before her. She was wearing a simpler dress today, dark blue rather than morning black, and her hair was arranged in a practical knot at the nape of her neck. She looked up as he approached, and a smile transformed her face. "Kane," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her, "please join me." He removed his hat and sat, uncomfortable in these civilized surroundings. 5 years on the ranch, avoiding town whenever possible, had left him feeling out of place in such settings. "You look well," Grace said, studying him with those perceptive green eyes. "So do you," he replied, though well was a poor word for how she looked. She was still the most striking woman he'd ever seen, with her high cheekbones and determined chin. "I wasn't sure I'd come, but you did." She signaled for a second cup of coffee, which arrived promptly. "Tell me about James. How did it happen?" Kane wrapped his hands around the coffee cup, grateful for its warmth. "Pneumonia. Started as a cough after we got caught in a thunderstorm bringing cattle down from the north pasture. Within a week, he couldn't breathe without pain. Doctor did what he could, but—" He trailed off, the loss still too raw. Grace reached across the table, her fingers briefly touching his wrist. "I'm so sorry, Kane. I remember how close you two were." The touch, brief as it was, sent a jolt through him. "What about you, Grace? You said there's no husband." "What happened with Porter?" A shadow crossed her face. "We were married for 3 years. He died of typhoid in '76. I've been living with my aunt in Chicago since then. And your father passed last winter. The store belongs to me now, though I've had a manager running it." She took a sip of her coffee. "I came back to decide whether to sell it or return for good." The news of her father's death brought complicated feelings. Old Montgomery had been the barrier between them, the man who decided Grace was too good for a rancher. Now he was gone, and so was the husband he'd chosen for her. "I'm sorry for your losses," Kane said sincerely. as I am for yours. Grace's eyes held his. But I didn't just come to the cemetery for James, Kane. I came for you. When I heard you were alone now, She hesitated. I couldn't stay away. The words hung between them, full of possibilities that Kane had long thought extinguished. The dining room suddenly felt too small, too public for the conversation they needed to have. Would you ride out to the ranch with me? He asked abruptly. There's a place I'd like to show you. Surprise flickered across her face, followed by a warm smile. I'd like that very much. An hour later, they were riding side by side across the prairie, Grace seated comfortably on a gentle mare from the livery. She rode astride rather than side saddle, her split riding skirt allowing her the freedom of movement. Kane had always admired her horsemanship. It was one of the first things that had drawn him to her. The ranch has grown, Grace observed as they passed the boundaries of Blackwood land, marked by a sturdy fence line. Your father would be proud. James and I worked hard, Kane acknowledged. We have 4,000 head of cattle now and 30 horses in our breeding program. The railroad coming through last year made shipping easier. And you've been alone out here all this time. Her question was gentle, probing. Kane kept his eyes on the horizon. The ranch keeps me busy. Hank and the other hands are good company. That's not what I meant. He knew what she meant. Had there been other women? Yes, a few passing relationships that never took root, but no one had ever made him feel the way Grace had, and he'd stopped trying to find someone who could. I never married, if that's what you're asking, he said finally. They rode in silence for a while, cresting a small hill that offered a view of the entire valley. Below them lay a small lake, its waters reflecting the blue of the sky, surrounded by cottonwood trees just beginning to turn golden with autumn. This is what I wanted to show you, Kane said, dismounting and helping Grace down from her horse. We used to call it quiet water. My father brought us here to fish when we were boys. Grace walked to the edge of the hill, taking in the view. It's beautiful, Kane. I come here to think sometimes, he admitted, standing beside her. Came here a lot after I left town that last time. Grace turned to face him, the wind tugging strands of hair loose from her knot. I wanted to come after you, she said quietly. Every day for months I thought about saddling a horse and riding to your ranch, but I couldn't dishonor my father that way. I know, Kane said, though the words had haunted him for years. You did what you had to do. Did I? Her voice held a note of regret. I've asked myself that question every day since. I was raised to believe that a daughter's duty was absolute, that my father knew best. But he didn't know my heart, Kane. He didn't know that I gave it to you the first time you smiled at me across that store counter. The confession, so plainly stated, stole Kane's breath. 5 years of longing crystallized in that moment, and before he could think better of it, he reached for her, drawing her into his arms. She came willingly, her body fitting against his as perfectly as it had all those years ago. I never stopped loving you, he whispered against her hair. I tried, God knows I tried, but I couldn't do it. Grace looked up at him, tears shimmering in her eyes. Then don't try anymore. Their lips met in a kiss that bridged the years between them, hesitant at first, then growing in urgency as old passions reignited. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, the years of separation dissolving like morning mist. We should get back, Kane said reluctantly, aware of the impropriety of their situation. People will talk. Grace's laugh was bright and unconcerned. Let them. I'm not a young girl anymore, Kane. I'm a widow who owns her own business. I can make my own choices now. They rode back to town more slowly, reluctant to end their time together. As they approached the hotel, Kane found himself dreading the moment they would part. Have dinner with me tonight, he said as he helped her dismount. There's a decent restaurant next to the bank. Grace smiled up at him. I'd like that very much, but first, there's something I need to do. She glanced down the street toward the general store that had once been her father's. I need to see the business, make some decisions. Kane nodded, understanding her need to settle her affairs. I'll come for you at 7. As he watched her climb the hotel steps, a strange feeling settled over him, something like hope, fragile but persistent. For the first time in 5 years, Kane allowed himself to imagine a future that included more than just the ranch and his solitary existence. The afternoon stretched before him, and rather than return immediately to the ranch, Kane decided to take care of some business in town. He needed supplies anyway, and there were matters at the bank that required his attention now that he was sole owner of the Blackwood holdings. As he walked down the main street, several townspeople stopped him to offer condolences about James. Kane accepted their sympathies with quiet thanks, uncomfortable with the attention but appreciative of the community's respect for his brother. Outside the bank, he encountered Sheriff Pete Lawson, a grizzled veteran of the frontier who'd kept order in Redemption Creek for over a decade. "Kane," the sheriff nodded, extending his hand. "Good to see you in town. Sorry about James." "Thanks, Pete." Kane shook the offered hand. "How are things?" "Quiet enough," Lawson replied, squinting up at the sun. "Though we've had reports of the Delaney gang operating north of here, might want to warn your hands to keep an eye out." The news was concerning. The Delaney brothers had been terrorizing settlements throughout the territory for the past year, robbing banks and stagecoaches with increasing boldness. "I'll let the men know," Kane assured him. "They won't find easy pickings at the Blackwood Ranch." "Saw you riding with Miss Montgomery earlier," the sheriff commented, his tone casual but his eyes shrewd. "Heard she's back to decide what to do with the store." News traveled fast in Redemption Creek. "That's right," Kane replied, not elaborating. Lawson gave him a knowing look. "Some might say fate has a way of giving second chances to those who deserve them." Before Kane could respond, the sheriff tipped his hat and continued on his rounds, leaving Kane to consider his words. A second chance. Was that what this was? The very idea sent a surge of anticipation through him. At precisely 7 o'clock, Kane presented himself at the hotel, freshly shaved and wearing his best shirt under his dark coat. The clerk directed him to the small sitting room off the lobby, where Grace was waiting. She stood as he entered, and the sight of her stole his words. She wore a dress of deep burgundy, more fashionable than anything he remembered her wearing before her time in Chicago. Her hair was arranged in an elegant style that highlighted the graceful curve of her neck, and a simple gold pendant rested at her throat. "You look beautiful," he managed finally. A blush colored her cheeks. "Thank you. You clean up rather well yourself, Mr. Blackwood." The restaurant was one of the newer establishments in town, catering to the increasing number of travelers brought by the railroad. They were seated at a corner table, relatively private in the half-full dining room once they had ordered. Grace leaned forward slightly. "I went to the store today. It's changed very little since I left. Mr. Perkins has kept it running smoothly. And have you decided what to do with it?" She turned her wine glass slowly between her fingers. "I'm not selling," she said decisively. "This is my home, Kane. I realize now that it always has been. Chicago was just somewhere I was existing, not living." The implications of her statement sent a wave of hope through Kane. "So you're staying in Redemption Creek?" "I am." Her eyes met his, steady and clear. "I've lived according to others' expectations for too long. It's time I followed my own heart." The arrival of their food interrupted the moment, but throughout the meal, an undercurrent of anticipation flowed between them. They spoke of the years they'd been apart, filling in the gaps in each other's lives. Kane told her about the ranch's expansion, about the difficult years following his father's death when he and James had struggled to keep the operation afloat. Grace shared stories of her life in Chicago, of the literary society she'd joined, and the suffrage meetings she'd attended in secret. "Edwin wouldn't have approved," she explained, a hint of old frustration in her voice. "He expected a traditional wife, one who concerned herself only with household matters and social appearances. Were you happy with him?" Kane asked, the question that had tormented him for years finally finding voice. Grace considered her answer carefully. "I respected him," she said at last. "He was kind in his way and he never mistreated me. But no, Kane, I wasn't happy, not in the way I believe a marriage should be." Their eyes met across the table, the unspoken comparison hanging between them, the passion they'd shared during their brief courtship, the deep connection that had formed so quickly. After dinner, Kane walked her back to the hotel, their steps slow, neither wanting the evening to end. At the bottom of the hotel steps, Grace turned to face him. "Would you show me more of the ranch tomorrow?" she asked. "I'd like to see what you and James built together." I'd be honored, Kane replied, taking her hand and pressing a kiss to her knuckles. I'll come for you at 10. The next morning dawned clear and crisp, a perfect autumn day. Kane arrived at the hotel to find Grace already waiting, dressed practically in a simple riding outfit and sturdy boots. They rode out to the ranch at a leisurely pace, Kane pointing out landmarks and boundaries as they went. The ranch house came into view, solid and welcoming against the backdrop of distant hills. Several of the hands were working in the corral nearest the house, breaking a new batch of horses. They tipped their hats respectfully as Kane and Grace rode past. "This is magnificent, Kane," Grace said as they dismounted in front of the house. "Your father would be so proud of what you've accomplished." Kane helped her down, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary. "Come inside. Mrs. Tompkins will have coffee ready." The housekeeper, a widow who'd been cooking for the Blackwood Ranch for nearly 15 years, greeted Grace warmly. "Miss Montgomery, how wonderful to see you again after all these years." Grace embraced the older woman. "It's good to see you too, Mrs. Tompkins. Your cooking is still legendary in town, you know." "Flattery will get you everywhere, my dear," the housekeeper chuckled, ushering them into the dining room where coffee and freshly baked biscuits awaited. After they'd eaten, Kane gave Grace a tour of the house, the spacious living room with its stone fireplace, the study where he kept the ranch records, and the upstairs bedrooms, most of which stood empty and waiting. "It's a house built for a family," Grace observed as they returned downstairs. "It must have been lonely with just you and James." "It was," Kane admitted. "After Father died, the house seemed too big, too quiet. Having the hands for meals helped, but still." They stepped out onto the wide front porch that wrapped around two sides of the house. From here, they could see the entire ranch yard, the bunkhouse where the hands lived, the large barn, the corrals, and beyond them, the vast expanse of Blackwood land stretching toward the horizon. "I'd like to show you something else," Kane said, leading her down the steps and toward a path that led away from the main buildings. "Something James and I were working on before he fell ill." The path wound through a stand of cottonwoods before opening onto a clearing about a quarter-mile from the main house. There, nestled among the trees, stood the frame of a small cabin, its construction not yet complete. "James wanted his own place," Kane explained as they walked around the structure. "Somewhere he could start his own family someday while still being close to the main ranch. We started building it this spring." Grace ran her hand along one of the half-finished walls. "Will you finish it?" Kane looked at the cabin, the physical manifestation of his brother's dreams for the future dreams that would never be realized now. "I think I should, for him." They spent the rest of the day exploring the ranch, riding out to see the cattle grazing in the north pasture and stopping by the creek where Kane and James had fished as boys. By the time they returned to the main house, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. "Stay for dinner," Kane said as they stood on the porch watching the changing light. "Mrs. Tompkins always makes enough for an army." Grace hesitated, aware of the impropriety of dining alone with him at his home, especially as night approached. But something had shifted between them during the day, a return of the easy companionship they'd once shared, deepened now by maturity and shared experiences of loss. "I'd like that," she agreed. Dinner was a relaxed affair with Mrs. Tompkins serving a hearty stew and fresh bread before tactfully retiring to her own quarters at the back of the house. They ate in the dining room, the large table that usually hosted the ranch hands now set intimately for two. "Tell me about your plans for the store," Kane said as they lingered over coffee after the meal. Grace's eyes lit up with enthusiasm. "I want to expand it. Redemption Creek is growing and the store needs to grow with it. I was thinking of adding a section for books and perhaps some finer goods from back east. Women here shouldn't have to order everything by catalog." "Sounds like you've given it a lot of thought." "I have," she admitted. "Even in Chicago, I kept up with the territorial newspapers, tracking the growth of the town. I think there's real opportunity here now, especially with the railroad." Kane watched her, captivated by her passion and business acumen. This was a side of Grace he'd glimpsed years ago, but was seeing in full bloom now, a woman who knew her own mind and had the courage to forge her own path. "You'll need help," he said. "Running a business that size alone isn't easy. Are you offering, Mr. Blackwood?" A teasing smile played at her lips. "Maybe I am," he replied, surprising himself with the admission. "The ranch practically runs itself these days, with Hank overseeing the hands. I could spare some time to help with accounts or ordering." The offer hung between them, representing more than just business assistance. It was a first step toward a shared future, tentative but real. Later, as they stood on the porch waiting for Hank to bring around the buggy that would take Grace back to town, the night air wrapped around them like a blanket, crisp and cool. "Thank you for today," Grace said softly. "Seeing the ranch, understanding the life you've built here, it means a great deal to me." Kane moved closer, drawn to her in the moonlight. "Grace, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." She looked up at him, her expression open. "Always." "Why did you really come back to Redemption Creek? Was it truly just for the store?" Grace took a deep breath, her gaze never wavering. "No, the store was part of it, but not all. When I heard about James, when I knew you were alone." She paused, gathering her courage. "I realized life is too short to deny what's in your heart. I've spent 5 years trying to forget you, Kane. I couldn't do it for another day." Her honesty, so straightforward and unadorned, broke something open inside him. Kane pulled her into his arms, his lips finding hers in a kiss that spoke of years of longing, of possibilities now within reach. Grace responded with equal fervor, her arms winding around his neck as she pressed herself against him. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing heavily, the years of separation burning away in the heat of rediscovered passion. "I love you, Grace Montgomery," Kane whispered against her temple. "I never stopped." "And I love you," she replied, her voice steady and sure. "I always have." The sound of hooves announced Hank's arrival with the buggy. Reluctantly, they separated, though their hands remained linked. "Come to the store tomorrow," Grace said as Kane helped her into the buggy. "I want to show you my plans." Kane nodded, already counting the hours until he would see her again. "Tomorrow, then." He watched until the buggy disappeared down the road, then turned back to the house that suddenly seemed less empty, less quiet, filled now with the promise of a future he'd thought forever lost. The next few weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity and rekindled romance. Each day, Kane would ride into town to help Grace with the renovations to the store. They worked side by side, clearing out old inventory, designing the new layout, and planning the expansion into the vacant space next door that Grace had purchased from the reluctant owner with shrewd negotiation. The townspeople watched their renewed relationship with interest, gossiping behind their hands, but generally approving. Grace had always been well-liked in Redemption Creek, and many remembered the way she and Kane had looked at each other years ago, before her father's intervention. "They're saying we're courting again," Grace informed Kane one afternoon as they unpacked a shipment of books for the new section of the store. "Mrs. Wilson at the bakery asked me directly if we had set a date yet." Kane looked up from the crate he was opening, a smile tugging at his lips. "And what did you tell her?" "That it was premature to discuss such things," Grace replied primly, though her eyes danced with amusement. "She didn't believe me for a second." The truth was, they hadn't discussed marriage explicitly, though it hung in the air between them like a promise waiting to be spoken. They were taking their time, rediscovering each other, building a foundation that wouldn't crumble under pressure as it had before. Every evening, they would share dinner, either at the restaurant in town or at the ranch, where Mrs. Tompkins had taken to preparing special meals whenever Grace visited. Afterward, they would sit on the porch or by the fire, talking late into the night about their dreams for the future. It was during one such evening, nearly a month after James's funeral, that Kane finally broached the subject that had been on his mind. "The cabin," he said as they sat before the fireplace in the ranch house living room, the autumn night growing cold outside. "I've been thinking about finishing it." Grace looked up from the book she'd been reading. "For James's memory, partly," Kane admitted, "but also because I have my own reasons now." He shifted to face her more directly. "Grace, I know we've been taking things slowly, and I respect that. But I need you to know that for me, this isn't temporary. What I feel for you, what I've always felt, it's forever. Grace closed her book, her full attention on him. I feel the same way, Kane. I think perhaps I always knew we'd find our way back to each other someday. Kane took her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. Then I want to finish that cabin, not for James, but for us. A place we could start our life together, if that's what you want. The implication was clear, and Grace's eyes widened slightly. Are you asking me to marry you, Kane Blackwood? I reckon I am, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Though I'd planned something more romantic than discussing construction plans by the fire. Grace's laugh was bright and joyous. It's perfect, she assured him, moving closer until she was seated beside him on the sofa. And yes, Kane. Yes, I will marry you. He kissed her then, a kiss full of promise and future, sealing the commitment they'd made to each other. When they broke apart, Grace's eyes were shining with unshed tears of happiness. I was thinking spring, she said, her hands framing his face. After the store renovation is complete and the cabin is finished. Spring sounds perfect, Kane agreed, pulling her close against his side. Though it's going to be the longest winter of my life, waiting to make you my wife. Grace laughed again, resting her head on his shoulder. We've waited 5 years already. A few more months won't kill us. As winter descended on the Dakota Territory, blanketing the land in snow and ice, Kane and Grace continued their preparations. The store renovation progressed steadily, with the grand reopening planned for early March. At the ranch, Kane and his hands worked on the cabin whenever weather permitted, transforming the simple structure James had envisioned into a comfortable home for a new beginning. Grace officially moved from the hotel to her father's old quarters above the store, though she spent many evenings at the ranch, returning to town only because propriety demanded it. Their engagement was announced in the Redemption Creek Gazette, generating a flurry of congratulations and well wishes from the community. Christmas came, bringing with it a celebration at the ranch that included all the hands and several friends from town. Grace decorated the house with pine boughs and red ribbons, filling the rooms with the scent of cinnamon and spice, as she and Mrs. Tompkins prepared a feast for 20. Standing in the doorway of the dining room, watching Grace direct the placement of dishes with cheerful authority, Kane felt a contentment he hadn't known in years. This was what the house had been built for: family, laughter, the warmth of belonging. The winter months passed in a blur of work and anticipation. By early March, both the store renovation and the cabin were nearing completion. The wedding was set for the first weekend in April, when the worst of winter would be behind them and spring would be bringing new life to the land. It was during this time of happy preparation that trouble finally found its way to Redemption Creek. The Delaney gang, emboldened by successful raids on smaller settlements, rode into town one Wednesday morning in late March, their target the newly prosperous bank. Kane was at the ranch when Hank rode in, his horse lathered from hard riding. Delaney's hit the bank, Hank reported breathlessly as he dismounted. Sheriffs formed a posse. Thought you should know Miss Grace was in town. Cold fear gripped Kane's heart. Was anyone hurt? Don't know details, Hank replied. Just heard they rode through, shooting up the place, then took off north with the bank's money. Sheriff thinks they're heading for the border. Kane was already moving toward the stables. Saddle Demon, he ordered, and get the rifles. The ride to town was the longest of Kane's life, every terrible possibility running through his mind. The main street was in chaos when he arrived. People gathered in small groups, discussing the robbery in agitated tones. The bank's windows were shattered, and bullet holes peppered the wooden facade. Kane dismounted before Demon had fully stopped, pushing through the crowd toward the general store. Relief flooded through him when he saw Grace standing on the sidewalk outside, unharmed but visibly shaken. Kane. She cried when she saw him, running into his arms. Thank God you're here. He held her tightly, his heart still racing with fear. Are you all right? Were you in the bank? No, she assured him, drawing back to look at his face. I was in the store when we heard the shots, Mr. Porter was killed, Kane, and young Billy Teague, who works as a clerk. Her voice broke. They just rode in shooting, not caring who they hit. Edwin Porter's father, the banker who had once been set to become Grace's father-in-law. The news sent a wave of complicated emotions through Kane. Sheriff Lawson approached them, his expression grim. "Kane, figured you'd be along. We're gathering a posse to go after them. Could use a man who knows the Northern Territory like you do." Kane looked down at Grace, torn between his desire to stay with her and his sense of duty to the community. She read the conflict in his eyes and straightened her shoulders. "Go," she said firmly. "Help catch them before they hurt anyone else." "I'll be back as soon as I can," Kane promised, pressing a quick kiss to her forehead. "Stay at the ranch with Mrs. Tompkins until we return. It's safer there." Grace nodded, her eyes full of worry but her voice steady. "Be careful. Remember what you have to come back to." Within the hour, Kane was riding north with the posse, a group of 12 men determined to bring the Delaney's to justice. The gang had a head start, but they were slowed by the weight of their stolen money and the need to avoid main roads. The pursuit lasted 3 days, following the gang's trail through increasingly rugged terrain. On the morning of the 4th day, they caught up to the Delaney's at a small cabin in the foothills, where the gang had stopped to rest their horses. The ensuing gunfight was brief but intense. 2 of the Delaney's were killed, and another wounded, while one member of the posse took a bullet in the shoulder. The remaining gang members, including the notorious leader, Frank Delaney, surrendered when they realized they were outgunned. "You've caused enough grief," Sheriff Lawson told the captured outlaws as they were bound for the journey back to Redemption Creek. "Judge will be in town next month. You'll hang for what you did to Porter and the Teague boy." The return journey was slower, hampered by the need to transport prisoners and the wounded. It was nearly a week after the robbery when Kane finally rode back into the ranch yard, exhausted but satisfied that justice had been served. Grace ran from the house as soon as she heard the hoofbeats, her face lighting up at the sight of him. Kane dismounted stiffly, his body aching from days in the saddle, but the pain disappeared as Grace flew into his arms. "Thank God," she whispered against his neck. "I've been so worried." "I'm fine," he assured her, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair. "We got them all. They won't hurt anyone else." That night, after he'd bathed and eaten the meal Mrs. Tompkins had prepared, Kane and Grace sat on the porch, watching the stars emerge in the evening sky. Despite his exhaustion, Kane felt a strange restlessness, a need to hold tight to the happiness he'd found. "I don't want to wait until April," he said suddenly, turning to face Grace on the porch swing. "I want to marry you now as soon as possible." Grace studied his face in the fading light. "Because of the Delaney's. Because life is uncertain," partly, Kane admitted. "But also because I can't see any reason to wait. The cabin is nearly finished. The store reopening can happen whether we're married or not. I just want to start our life together, Grace. Now, not later." A slow smile spread across her face. "Then let's do it. The day after tomorrow, we'll ask Reverend Matthews to perform the ceremony right here at the ranch." The simple wedding took place 2 days later on the front porch of the Blackwood ranch house. Grace wore a dress of pale blue silk that she'd been saving for the April ceremony, and Kane dressed in his best suit, freshly pressed by Mrs. Tompkins. The ceremony was attended by the ranch hands, Sheriff Lawson, and a few close friends from town. Reverend Matthews kept the service brief but meaningful, speaking of love's endurance through separation and trials. When Kane slipped the gold band onto Grace's finger, a ring that had once belonged to his mother, his hands were steady, his heart full. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the Reverend declared. "Mr. Kane, you may kiss your bride." The kiss they shared was both a culmination and a beginning, sealing the promise of a future that had once seemed impossible. The small gathering erupted in cheers and well wishes, Hank leading the hands in a raucous celebration that continued well into the evening. Later, after the guests had departed and night had fallen over the ranch, Kane led Grace to the cabin that would be their home. He'd worked with the hands all the previous day to complete the final touches, hanging curtains Grace had sewn, arranging the furniture they'd selected together, lighting the fireplace to ward off the early spring chill. "Welcome home, Mrs. Blackwood," Kane said as he carried her over the threshold, the old tradition feeling right for this new beginning. Grace looked around at the cozy interior, her eyes shining with happiness. "It's perfect, Kane. Everything I could have wanted." They spent their first night as husband and wife in the cabin James had started, now transformed into the beginning of their own legacy. As they lay together in the darkness, the wind whispering through the cottonwoods outside, Kane felt a sense of completion that had eluded him for years. "I used to dream about this," Grace confessed, her head resting on his chest. "During those years in Chicago, I would close my eyes and imagine what our life might have been like if things had been different." Kane stroked her hair, marveling at the twist of fate that had brought her back to him. "And now we don't have to imagine anymore." Spring bloomed across the Dakota Territory, turning the prairie into a carpet of wildflowers. The grand reopening of Montgomery's General Store, now Blackwood's General Store, was a success, with customers from miles around coming to see the expanded inventory and new book section that Grace had established. Kane divided his time between the ranch and the store, finding a balance that allowed him to maintain the Blackwood legacy while supporting Grace's business ambitions. They worked as partners in all things, each bringing their strengths to their shared life. In late summer, as the first anniversary of James's death approached, Kane rode alone to the cemetery on the hill overlooking Redemption Creek. He stood before his brother's grave, hat in hand, the warm August breeze ruffling his hair. "I wish you could have been at the wedding, James," he said quietly. "You would have approved of how we finished the cabin, made a few changes to your plans, but the bones of it are still yours." He paused, looking out over the town that had grown significantly in the past year. New buildings had sprung up along the main street, and a school was under construction at the edge of town. "Grace is expecting," Kane continued, a smile touching his lips. "Due in January. If it's a boy, we're going to name him James." He traced the lettering on the gravestone with his fingertips. "I miss you every day, brother, but I wanted you to know that I'm happy, truly happy." As he turned to leave, Kane was startled to see Grace standing a few yards away, having approached silently while he was speaking. She wore a simple dress that did little to disguise the gentle swell of her pregnancy, and her face was soft with understanding. "I didn't want to interrupt," she said, moving to stand beside him, "but I thought you might want company after all." Kane slipped his arm around her waist, drawing her close against his side. "I was just telling James about the baby." Grace laid a hand on the gravestone, a gesture of respect and connection. "I think he knows," she said softly. "I think he's been watching over us all along." They stood together for a long moment, united in remembrance and hope. Then, hand in hand, they walked back down the hill toward the horses that would carry them home to the ranch, to the life they were building together, a life that had seemed impossible just a year before. As they rode side by side across the prairie, the setting sun painting the landscape in gold and amber, Kane looked over at his wife, the woman who had returned to him against all odds, who had taken his hand at a graveside and led him back to happiness. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't come to the cemetery that day?" he asked. Grace considered the question, her face thoughtful in the evening light. "Sometimes. But then I remember something my aunt told me once, that love, real love, always finds its way home eventually." Kane reached across the space between them, taking her hand as they rode. She was right. "Yes," Grace agreed, her fingers tightening around his. She was. The years that followed brought both joys and challenges to the Blackwood family. James Kane Blackwood was born on a snowy January night in 1879, his lusty cries filling the cabin with new life. 2 years later, he was joined by a sister, Elizabeth Rose, named for both their grandmothers. The ranch prospered under Kane's management, expanding its operations to include one of the largest horse breeding programs in the territory. The General Store became a cornerstone of Redemption Creek's growing economy, with Grace introducing innovations that drew customers from neighboring towns. When Dakota Territory was split, and South Dakota achieved statehood in 1889, Kane was among those selected to represent the region at the celebrations. Standing with Grace on the steps of the new state capitol, watching the stars and stripes rise over a land that had once been wilderness, he felt a profound sense of belonging to both the place and the woman beside him. "Did you ever imagine this?" Grace asked, her arm linked through his, their children now 4 in number watching the ceremony with wide eyes. "Not all of it," Kane admitted, looking down at their family. But from the moment you took my hand in that cemetery, I started to believe anything was possible. On cool autumn evenings, they would sometimes ride together to Quiet Water, the lake that had witnessed their reunion. There, with the cottonwoods turning gold around them, they would watch the sunset and remember the long journey that had brought them together, the separation, the grief, and the unexpected second chance that had changed everything. And occasionally, they would visit the cemetery on the hill, standing together before James's grave, telling him about the children who bore his name and his spirit, about the ranch that continued his legacy, about the love that had survived against all odds. He would be proud of all of it, Grace would say, her hand warm in Kane's. Yes, Kane would agree, looking at the woman who had returned to him when he needed her most. He would. In later years, when their children were grown and had children of their own, Kane and Grace would sit on the porch of the ranch house, watching a new generation of Blackwoods learn to ride and rope and love the land. On one such evening, as the sun set over the prairie they had both come to call home, Kane turned to his wife, her beauty undimmed by the passing decades. "I never thanked you," he said, taking her hand as he had countless times over the years. "For what?" Grace asked, her green eyes still bright and perceptive. "For taking my hand that day at the cemetery, for being brave enough to come back." Grace smiled, the same smile that had captured his heart all those years ago in her father's store. "I wasn't brave, Kane, I was just following my heart home." As twilight deepened into night, they remained on the porch, hands entwined, surrounded by the legacy they had built together, a legacy of love that had overcome separation, grief, and time itself, to find its way home at last.